The morning light filtered through the cracked blinds of apartment 214, casting thin golden stripes across the kitchen table where Lena Harper sat with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She hadn't slept well in months, maybe years, and the dark circles under her eyes told the story her voice refused to speak aloud. Across from her, her son Eli sat perfectly still, his fingers tracing the rim of his cereal bowl in slow, deliberate circles, counting each rotation under his breath. 1, 2, 3, 4. The rhythm soothed him. She knew that now, though it had taken her years to understand that what others called strange was simply his way of making sense of a world that moved too fast and spoke too loud. She watched him the way mothers do when they're trying to memorize their children's faces, as if each morning might be the last time she sees him exactly like this. Eli was 15 now, tall and lean with his father's dark hair and her pale green eyes, though his gaze rarely met anyone else's for long. He wore the same navy blue hoodie he'd worn for 3 days straight, the one with the frayed cuffs he rubbed between his thumb and forefinger when he felt anxious. Lena had learned to read these small gestures like a second language, a vocabulary of tics and patterns that told her when he was overwhelmed, when he needed space, when the world was pressing in too hard. She reached across the table and gently touched his wrist, just once, and he looked up briefly before returning his attention to the cereal that had gone soggy in the milk. The bus would arrive in 12 minutes, and she knew he'd counted down every second until then, his internal clock more precise than any watch she'd ever owned. Lena stood and moved to the counter, wrapping his lunch in the same brown paper bag she used every day because he couldn't tolerate the crinkle of plastic. Turkey sandwich cut diagonally, not straight across. Apple slices in a small container, never a whole apple. Crackers in groups of 8 because 8 was an even number, and even numbers felt safe. She'd learned these rules through trial and error, through meltdowns in grocery stores and sleepless nights when he was younger, before she understood that his mind simply processed the world through a different filter than most people. Some called it a disability. She called it Eli. The apartment was small, just 2 bedrooms in a complex where the paint peeled in humid summers and the heat barely worked in winter, but it was theirs. She'd fought for it after the divorce, after Eli's father had looked at his own son like he was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. The courts had given her full custody without much of a fight, which should have felt like a victory, but instead felt like confirmation that even the man who'd helped create Eli couldn't see past the diagnosis. Autism spectrum disorder, the doctors had said when he was 4, and those 3 words had become both an explanation and an excuse for everyone who decided he wasn't worth the effort of understanding. But Lena had never needed a label to love her son. She'd needed patience, research, sleepless nights learning about sensory processing and communication styles, and a stubborn refusal to let the world define what Eli could or couldn't become. She heard the rumble of the school bus outside and watched as Eli stood without prompting, slinging his backpack over one shoulder with mechanical precision. He moved to the door, paused, then turned back to look at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. For a moment she thought he might say something, might offer one of his rare observations about the weather, or a fact he'd learned about marine biology, his current obsession. Instead, he just nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement, and stepped into the hallway. Lena followed him to the doorway and watched as he descended the stairs with careful, measured steps, always leading with his right foot first. She wanted to call out, to tell him she loved him, to warn him that the world could be cruel to people who were different, but she'd learned that her words often felt like static to him, overwhelming and unnecessary. So she just watched until he disappeared around the corner, her heart carrying the weight of every unspoken worry a mother holds. The apartment felt emptier once he left, the silence pressing in like a physical thing. Lena returned to the kitchen and finally poured the cold coffee down the sink, watching the dark liquid spiral down the drain. She'd worked the night shift at the diner on Route 42, serving truckers and insomniacs until 3 in the morning, then come home to sleep for 4 hours before starting the morning routine with Eli. Her body ached with the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. The bone-deep weariness of a woman who'd been fighting uphill for so long she'd forgotten what level ground felt like. But she couldn't afford to slow down. Couldn't afford to miss a shift, or lose this job, like she'd lost the last one when Eli had a meltdown at school, and she'd had to leave work in the middle of lunch rush. Her boss at the diner, a gruff man named Carl who'd seen his share of hard luck stories, had given her more grace than most, but she knew that grace had limits. She moved through the apartment, picking up the small debris of their life together. Eli's notebooks stacked in perfect right angles on the coffee table, each one filled with detailed sketches of ocean creatures drawn with scientific precision. His shoes lined up by the door in order of size, even though he only ever wore the black sneakers. The weighted blanket folded exactly in half on the couch, the one thing that helped him sleep when his mind wouldn't stop racing. These were the artifacts of a life most people would never understand, a carefully constructed world built around one boy's need for order in chaos. And Lena had built it brick by brick, learning as she went, making mistakes and correcting them, becoming fluent in a language that had no words. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she glanced at the screen to see a text from her sister Rachel, asking if she wanted to grab coffee that weekend. Lena typed out a polite excuse, something about work and Eli's schedule, the same deflection she'd been using for years. Rachel meant well, but she'd never understood why Lena couldn't just leave Eli with a babysitter for a few hours, why a simple outing required days of preparation and the right kind of reassurance. Family gatherings had become minefields of unsolicited advice and pitying looks, relatives who spoke about Eli in hushed tones as if he were fragile or broken. She'd stopped attending most of them, preferring the isolation to the exhaustion of explaining that different wasn't wrong, that her son's mind was wired for precision and depth in ways that made him brilliant, not damaged. The clock on the microwave read 7:48, which meant Eli would be arriving at school in exactly 7 minutes if the bus stayed on schedule. Lena had his entire day mapped in her mind because he'd shown her his schedule so many times she'd memorized it. First period biology, second period geometry, third period English, where he struggled because metaphors felt like lies, and poetry seemed designed to obscure meaning rather than clarify it. Fourth period was lunch, and that's where her mind always caught and held, because lunch meant the cafeteria, and the cafeteria meant 300 students packed into one room with fluorescent lights and competing conversations and the constant scrape of chairs on linoleum. She knew he ate alone most days, sitting at the corner table near the emergency exit where the noise felt more manageable, where he could observe without participating. She'd asked him once if he was lonely, and he'd looked at her with genuine confusion, as if loneliness required wanting something he didn't actually want. He'd told her that other people were exhausting, that their social rules made no sense, that he preferred the company of his own thoughts. And she'd believed him mostly, except for the moments when she caught him watching groups of laughing teenagers with an expression that might have been longing or might have been simple curiosity. She couldn't always tell, and that uncertainty haunted her in the quiet hours before dawn. What if he did want friends but didn't know how to make them? What if his preference for solitude was actually resignation disguised as choice? These questions circled her mind like birds of prey, and she had no answers that brought comfort. Lena pulled on her jacket and grabbed her purse, preparing for the errands that filled the space between morning and her next shift. The grocery store where she'd learned to shop during senior hour to avoid crowds. The pharmacy where Eli's prescription waited. The medication that helped manage his anxiety without dulling the sharp edges of his brilliant mind. The bank where she'd cash her paycheck and divide it into envelopes labeled rent, utilities, food, emergency, each one never quite full enough. This was her life now, a carefully balanced equation where one unexpected expense could topple everything. But she'd been balancing on this edge for so long that the precariousness had become familiar, almost comfortable in its consistency. She locked the apartment door and descended the same stairs Eli had taken 30 minutes earlier, her hand trailing along the railing he never touched because he didn't like the texture of painted metal. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of rain that might come later, and she stood for a moment in the parking lot looking toward the direction of Eli's school. Somewhere in that brick building 3 miles away, her son was navigating a world designed for people whose minds worked nothing like his. And she couldn't protect him from that. Couldn't shield him from the casual cruelty of teenagers who didn't understand that different didn't mean less, All she could do was be here when he came home, ready to listen if he wanted to talk or sit in comfortable silence if he didn't. What Lena didn't know, couldn't know as she climbed into her aging sedan with the check engine light that never turned off, was that today would be different. That something was already in motion at Meadowbrook High School, something that would test everything she'd taught Eli about dignity and strength and standing firm in who you are even when the world demands you be someone else. She turned the key in the ignition and pulled out of the parking lot, completely unaware that the phone call would come in less than 3 hours, that she'd have to leave the grocery store with a half-filled cart, that by the time she arrived at the school the damage would already be done. But for now, in this moment, she simply drove through the familiar streets of their small town, counting the minutes until she could return home and wait for the sound of Eli's key in the lock. Have you ever watched someone you love walk into a situation you knew might hurt them, but couldn't warn them because they needed to face it on their own? Put your thoughts in the comments below. The hallways of Meadowbrook High School smelled like floor cleaner and teenage anxiety, a combination Eli had learned to tolerate through sheer repetition. He moved through the crowded corridor with his backpack pulled tight against his shoulders, his gaze fixed on the scuffed linoleum 3 feet ahead of him. The noise was a wall of sound that pressed against his ears, lockers slamming like gunshots, voices overlapping in a chaos that made his jaw clench. He counted his steps, one footfall after another, using the rhythm to block out everything else. 23 steps to his locker. Turned the combination right twice, left once, right again to the final number. The mechanical precision of it calmed the buzzing in his mind. His locker was number 172, wedged between a dented one that belonged to nobody and another covered in stickers of bands he'd never heard of. Eli opened it and began the morning ritual of exchanging books, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Biology textbook out, geometry textbook in. English folder transferred from backpack to locker shelf. Everything had its place, its order, and maintaining that order was the scaffolding that held his day together. He was reaching for his biology notebook when he felt the shift in the air behind him, that subtle change in pressure that meant someone had entered his personal space without permission. "Hey, robot boy." The voice belonged to Marcus Chen, a junior with an athletic build and the kind of easy confidence that came from never having to think about whether people liked him. Eli didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the nickname that had followed him since freshman year. Robot boy because he didn't make eye contact. Robot boy because his voice was flat and monotone. Robot boy because he stimmed with his hands when he got overwhelmed, and apparently that looked mechanical to people whose brains worked differently than his. He'd learned that ignoring Marcus usually made him move on faster, that engagement only fed whatever need drove him to seek out targets. But today, Marcus didn't move on. He leaned against the locker next to Eli's, close enough that Eli could smell his cologne, something sharp and expensive that made Eli's nose wrinkle. "Yo, I'm talking to you." Marcus waved a hand in front of Eli's face, and Eli finally turned his head just enough to acknowledge the intrusion. Marcus grinned, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, and Eli recognized it as the prelude to something worse. Behind Marcus stood 2 other boys, Tyler and Josh, both wearing matching expressions of anticipation. They were waiting for a show, Eli realized, and he was supposed to be the entertainment. "We've got a group project in biology," Marcus said, his voice loud enough that people passing by slowed their steps, sensing drama. "Mr. Patterson put you in our group. Can you believe that? Like we need dead weight dragging down our grade." Tyler laughed, a sharp bark of sound that made Eli flinch. Josh pulled out his phone, and Eli saw the camera lens pointed in his direction, the little red light indicating it was recording. His throat tightened, his hands beginning to shake in the way they did when stress overloaded his system. He wanted to walk away, to remove himself from this situation the way his mother had taught him, but his feet wouldn't move. "Come on, say something," Marcus pushed, stepping closer. "Or are you too busy counting ceiling tiles or whatever weird shit you do?" Eli's fingers found the hem of his hoodie, rubbing the fabric between his thumb and forefinger in rapid succession, the motion automatic and necessary. He knew he should respond, should defend himself with words, but language felt impossible right now, his thoughts moving too fast and too slow at the same time. The hallway had gone quiet, or maybe it just felt that way because all of Eli's attention had narrowed to this moment, to the three faces in front of him wearing expressions that mixed cruelty with curiosity. Mr. Patterson appeared at the end of the hallway, his biology textbook tucked under one arm, his attention focused on a stack of papers he was reading. Eli felt a surge of hope that the teacher would notice what was happening, would intervene the way adults were supposed to when students were being cruel. But Mr. Patterson walked right past them, his eyes never lifting from his papers, and Eli understood in that moment that he was alone in this. The adults at Meadowbrook High had mastered the art of selective blindness, seeing only what they chose to see, ignoring the daily acts of social violence that happened in their blind spots. "Tell you what," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a mock whisper that somehow carried across the hallway. "Why don't you just do all the work for the project? That's what you're good at, right? Following instructions like a good little robot? We'll put our names on it, take the credit, and everyone wins. Well, everyone who matters." Tyler and Josh laughed again, and Eli felt something crack inside his chest, a small breaking that he'd learned to expect but never got used to. He wanted to tell them that he wasn't a robot, that his mind worked differently but not less, that he felt everything more intensely than they probably ever would. But the words stayed trapped behind his teeth. The bell rang, shrill and demanding, and the hallway erupted into motion as students rushed toward their first period classes. Marcus clapped Eli on the shoulder, the gesture almost friendly if you didn't know the context, and walked away laughing with Tyler and Josh trailing behind him. Eli stood frozen at his locker, his biology notebook clutched against his chest, his breathing shallow and quick. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, could feel the familiar warning signs of a meltdown building like storm clouds. He needed to move, needed to get to class before he fell apart in public, but his body wouldn't cooperate. His mind was stuck in a loop, replaying Marcus's words, analyzing the laughter, trying to understand why being different was treated like a crime. When he finally made it to biology class, Mr. Patterson was already writing on the whiteboard, his back to the students filing in. Eli slipped into his usual seat in the back corner, the one by the window where he could look out at the parking lot when the fluorescent lights got too bright. Marcus and his friends sat 3 rows ahead, their heads together, still laughing about something. Eli opened his notebook and stared at the blank page, pen in hand, waiting for his thoughts to settle into something coherent. But all he could think about was Josh's phone, that little red recording light, and the question of where that video would end up. He'd seen what happened to videos like that, how they spread through social media like wildfire, how strangers who'd never met him would feel entitled to judge and mock and add their own commentary. "Mr. Patterson turned from the board and clapped his hands once for attention. "All right, everyone. Today we're diving deeper into your ecosystem projects. I've assigned groups of 4, and you'll have the next 3 weeks to research, create models, and present your findings." He began reading off names, pairing students seemingly at random, and Eli felt his stomach drop when he heard his own name followed by Marcus, Tyler, and Josh. Of course. The universe had a sense of humor, apparently. Marcus turned in his seat and gave Eli a theatrical wave, and several students near them snickered. Mr. Patterson either didn't notice or didn't care, continuing down his list without pause. The rest of the class passed in a blur that Eli couldn't focus through. Mr. Patterson talked about food chains and energy transfer, concepts Eli normally found fascinating, but today the information slid off his mind like water off glass. He kept his eyes on his notebook, filling the margins with small, precise drawings of jellyfish, his current favorite marine animal because they'd existed for over 500 million years, predating dinosaurs and surviving mass extinctions. If jellyfish could survive that long, he told himself, surely he could survive high school. But the logic felt hollow, a thought exercise that didn't translate to actual comfort. When the bell rang, releasing them to second period, Eli gathered his things quickly and tried to exit before Marcus could corner him again. But Tyler blocked his path at the door, his expression mockingly apologetic. "Hey, don't forget we need to exchange numbers for the project. You know, so we can tell you what to do." He thrust his phone at Eli expectantly, and Eli reluctantly typed in his number, knowing that refusing would only make things worse. Tyler grinned and immediately sent a text that made Eli's phone buzz in his pocket. When Eli checked it later in the hallway, it was a gif of a robot short-circuiting, accompanied by 3 laughing emojis. Geometry was marginally better because Marcus wasn't in that class, but Eli couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being the subject of conversations he couldn't hear. He caught glimpses of phones being passed between students, saw the quick flash of screens being hidden when teachers walked by. His imagination filled in the blanks, constructing scenarios where that hallway video had already gone viral, where his face was being shared and laughed at by hundreds or thousands of people he'd never meet. The anxiety built in his chest like pressure in a sealed container, and he pressed his palms flat against his desk, using the solid surface to ground himself in physical reality. By the time third period English rolled around, Eli had retreated so far inside himself that Mrs. Morrison's voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. She was talking about symbolism in The Great Gatsby, asking questions about green lights and Valley of Ashes, and normally Eli would have had thoughts about this because he understood symbols when they were explained literally. But today he couldn't connect to the material, couldn't find the energy to care about fictional people and their fictional problems when his own reality felt overwhelming enough. He stared at the book open on his desk, the words blurring into meaningless shapes. "Eli, can you tell us what the green light represents?" Mrs. Morrison's voice cut through his fog, and he realized with creeping horror that she was looking directly at him, waiting for an answer. The entire class had turned in their seats to stare, and Eli felt his face flush hot. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out, his mind blank and buzzing simultaneously. Someone in the back row coughed, and it sounded suspiciously like the word robot. Scattered laughter rippled through the classroom. Mrs. Morrison's expression shifted from expectant to concerned, and Eli wanted to disappear, to simply cease existing rather than endure another second of this public scrutiny. "It's okay," Mrs. Morrison said gently, too gently, the kind of gentle that highlighted his failure. "Let's have someone else answer." She called on another student, and the attention mercifully shifted away from Eli, but the damage was done. He spent the rest of class with his hoodie pulled up despite the rule against hoods indoors, his face hidden, his hands trembling in his lap. When the bell finally rang for lunch, Eli didn't feel relief. He felt dread, because lunch meant the cafeteria, and the cafeteria meant Marcus and Tyler and Josh, and today something told him it was going to get worse. The cafeteria assault on Eli's senses began before he even entered the double doors. The roar of 300 voices blended with clattering trays and scraping chairs into a wall of noise that made his teeth ache. He stood at the threshold for a moment, steeling himself, his hand gripping the strap of his backpack so tightly, his knuckles went white. This was the worst part of every day. The 42 minutes he had to endure before the blessed quiet of fifth period study hall. He could do this. He'd done it hundreds of times before. He moved through the lunch line on autopilot, selecting the same meal he always chose because predictability helped. Turkey sandwich, apple slices, carton of chocolate milk. The lunch lady, Mrs. Chen, gave him a kind smile that he couldn't quite return, his facial muscles not cooperating with the social expectation. He paid with the crumpled bills from his pocket and turned to face the vast landscape of the cafeteria, searching for his usual table in the far corner by the emergency exit. The path there required navigating between crowded tables, past groups of students who moved and shifted unpredictably, creating an obstacle course that changed every few seconds. He was halfway across the cafeteria when his foot caught on something, a backpack strap or an outstretched leg. He couldn't tell which. Time seemed to slow as he pitched forward, his tray tilting, his body unable to correct the fall. He hit the floor hard, his knees taking the impact, and his lunch scattered across the linoleum in a spectacular explosion of food and milk. The chocolate milk carton burst on impact, sending a brown river across the floor that pooled around his hands. The cafeteria didn't go silent the way it does in movies. Instead, the laughter started immediately, building like a wave, and Eli felt every eye turn toward him. "Oh shit, Robot Boy malfunctioned," Marcus's voice carried across the space, amplified by the acoustics of the large room. More laughter erupted, and Eli heard phones clicking, the distinctive sound of cameras capturing his humiliation for posterity. He stayed on the floor for a moment too long, frozen by the overwhelming sensory input, the cold milk soaking through his jeans, the grit of the floor against his palms, the laughter stabbing into his ears like knives. "Get up," his mind commanded, but his body wouldn't obey. "Get up before it gets worse." He finally pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaking, and saw Tyler standing nearby with his foot still extended, a grin splitting his face. It hadn't been an accident. Of course it hadn't. Eli bent to pick up his tray, his sandwich now decorated with floor dirt, his apple slices scattered like dice. A cafeteria monitor approached with a mop, her expression more annoyed than concerned, and she gestured for Eli to move aside. "You'll need to clean yourself up in the bathroom," she said flatly, and Eli nodded, unable to form words. He abandoned his ruined lunch and walked toward the exit, each step squishing in his milk-soaked shoes. The bathroom was mercifully empty, and Eli locked himself in the far stall, the one with the broken lock that nobody used. He sat on the closed toilet lid and pulled his knees to his chest, rocking slightly, a self-soothing motion that helped regulate the storm inside him. His hands were shaking so badly he had to clench them into fists. He wanted to call his mother, wanted to hear her voice telling him it would be okay. But his phone was in his backpack, and his backpack felt impossibly far away, even though it was right there on the floor beside him. The walls of the stall felt too close and too far away at the same time, and he focused on breathing, counting each inhale and exhale. He heard the bathroom door open and froze, his breath catching in his throat. Footsteps echoed on the tile, more than one person, and then Marcus's voice bounced off the walls. "Robot boy, you in here? We just want to talk about the project." Laughter followed, and Eli recognized Tyler's wheeze and Josh's deeper chuckle. They knew he was here. Of course they knew. He pulled his feet up onto the toilet so they wouldn't see his shoes under the stall door, hugging his knees tighter, making himself as small as possible. His heart hammered so hard he was certain they could hear it. "Come on, man. Don't be like that," Marcus continued, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "We're group members now. We need to collaborate." More laughter. Eli heard them moving through the bathroom, checking stalls, their footsteps deliberate and slow. They were hunting him, turning this into a game, and he was the prey. His mind raced through options. He could stay silent and hope they'd leave. He could try to run for the door. He could yell for help, though he knew from experience that help rarely came when you needed it most. Each option felt impossible. The footsteps stopped outside his stall, and Eli saw shadows through the gap at the bottom of the door. "Found him," Tyler announced. Someone kicked the door, hard, and the bang reverberated through the small space like an explosion. Eli flinched violently, his back hitting the wall behind the toilet. "Dude, come out. We're not going to hurt you." But the words felt like lies, and Eli's instincts screamed at him to stay put, to wait them out, to protect himself the only way he knew how. The silence stretched, taut and terrible, and Eli wondered how long they'd stand there before giving up. Then Josh's voice cut through, quieter than the others but somehow more menacing. "You know that video from this morning? The one where you're being a total freak at your locker? It's already got like 200 views on TikTok. My cousin shared it, and her friends are losing their minds. You're basically famous now, robot boy. Isn't that what you always wanted? To be seen?" The cruelty in his tone was casual, almost conversational, and that made it worse somehow. Eli felt something inside him crack wider, a fissure that had been forming for years finally splitting open. 200 views. Strangers watching him, judging him, adding him to their collection of people to mock. "Let's go," Marcus said finally. "He's not worth it." Probably crying in there anyway. Their footsteps retreated, the bathroom door opened and closed, and Eli was alone again. But the silence didn't bring relief. It brought shame, hot and suffocating, wrapping around his chest like a physical thing. He uncurled slowly, his muscles stiff from tension, and looked down at his milk-stained clothes. He couldn't go back to the cafeteria like this. He couldn't go to fifth period. He couldn't do anything except sit here and wait for the day to end, counting minutes like a prisoner counting days until release. His phone buzzed in his backpack, and he finally reached for it, his hands still trembling. 3 new messages in the group chat Marcus had created for their biology project. The first was the TikTok link, the video of him at his locker that morning, his hands stimming, his face showing the stress he'd been trying to hide. The caption read, "When the robot.exe stops working," with a skull emoji. The second message was from Tyler. "Yo, robot boy, you seeing this? You're trending LMAO." The third was from Josh, just a series of laughing emojis. Eli stared at the screen, his vision blurring, and made a decision he'd never made before in his entire academic career. He opened his messages and texted his mother a single word: help. Then he turned off his phone, pulled his hoodie over his head, and waited for her to come get him, knowing that asking for rescue meant admitting defeat, meant confirming every horrible thing Marcus and Tyler and Josh believed about him. But he couldn't do this alone anymore. The weight of pretending to be strong had finally exceeded his capacity to carry it, and something fundamental had shifted inside him during those moments trapped in the bathroom stall. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but it felt like the moment before a storm breaks, when the air goes still and electric and the world holds its breath. Lena's phone buzzed while she was restocking napkin dispensers at the diner, and she almost ignored it because Carl had a strict policy about personal phones during shifts. But something made her pause, some maternal instinct that operated beyond logic, and she pulled the phone from her apron pocket. The single word on her screen made her heart drop into her stomach. Help. Just that one word from Eli, and she knew without needing explanation that something had gone terribly wrong. Her son never asked for help, never admitted when things were too much, and that simple 4-letter word carried the weight of a crisis. She found Carl in the kitchen and explained in rushed sentences that she had to leave, that it was an emergency, that she'd make up the hours somehow. Carl looked at her with the expression of a man calculating losses, and she saw him weighing her value as an employee against the inconvenience of her departure. "This is the 3rd time this semester, Lena," he said. Not unkindly, but not warmly either. She nodded, already untying her apron, already moving toward the door. She'd deal with the consequences later. Right now, her son needed her, and that was the only calculation that mattered. The drive to Meadowbrook High took 12 minutes that felt like 12 hours. Lena's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her fingers ached, and she ran through scenarios in her mind, each one worse than the last. Was he hurt? Had he had a meltdown in front of everyone? Had someone done something to him? The possibilities multiplied like bacteria, and by the time she pulled into the school parking lot, her chest was tight with anxiety. She'd promised herself she wouldn't be one of those helicopter mothers, wouldn't swoop in to rescue him from every difficulty, but that promise evaporated when he asked for help. She found him in the front office, sitting in one of the plastic chairs with his hoodie pulled up and his arms wrapped around himself. The assistant principal, Mrs. Davidson, stood nearby with a clipboard, her expression caught between concern and bureaucratic efficiency. Eli's jeans were stained dark with something, and even from across the room Lena could see he was barely holding himself together. She crossed to him immediately and knelt in front of his chair, not touching him because she knew better than to initiate contact when he was overwhelmed. "I'm here," she said quietly. "I'm here now." Mrs. Davidson launched into an explanation about an incident in the cafeteria, something about a fall and spilled lunch, her words carefully neutral and frustratingly vague. "We're not sure exactly what happened," she said. But Eli became distressed and locked himself in the bathroom for over an hour. One of our monitors was concerned about his well-being. Lena listened with growing anger that she kept carefully controlled, recognizing the careful language designed to make this sound like Eli's problem rather than a failure of the school to protect him. She'd learned to read between the lines of these administrative conversations. "Did anyone see what caused him to fall?" Lena asked, still kneeling in front of Eli, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. Mrs. Davidson consulted her clipboard as if the answer might materialize there. The cafeteria was quite crowded. No one reported seeing anything unusual. Translation: no one was paying attention, or worse, everyone was paying attention, but chose to look away. Lena felt Eli's hand brush against her shoulder, the barest touch, and she understood it as permission to advocate for him, since he couldn't do it himself right now. "I'd like to take him home," Lena said, standing to face Mrs. Davidson at eye level. "He's clearly not in a state to continue his school day." The assistant principal nodded, already preparing the early dismissal form with practiced efficiency. "Of course. We understand that Eli has special needs that sometimes require accommodation. We'll mark this as an excused absence for medical reasons." Special needs. The phrase landed like a slap, reducing her brilliant, complex son to a checkbox on a form. But Lena bit back her response because getting Eli out of this building was more important than winning an argument with an administrator. They walked to the car in silence, Eli moving like someone in a trance, his eyes fixed on the ground 3 feet ahead of him. Lena wanted to ask what happened, wanted details so she could understand the full scope of whatever cruelty he'd endured, but she knew better than to push when he was like this. Information would come later, or it wouldn't come at all, and she'd learn to accept both possibilities. She unlocked the car and Eli folded himself into the passenger seat, immediately pulling his knees up and resting his forehead against them. The drive home was silent except for the hum of the engine and the occasional sniffle from Eli that told Lena he was crying, or trying not to cry, or somewhere in between. She kept her eyes on the road and one hand extended toward him without touching, a bridge available if he needed it. He didn't take her hand, but she saw him glance at it once, acknowledging the offer. That was enough. They communicated in these small gestures, a language developed over 15 years of learning each other's boundaries and needs. Back at the apartment, Eli went straight to his room without a word, and Lena heard the distinctive sound of his weighted blanket being pulled from the closet. She gave him space, knowing that solitude was his primary coping mechanism, and moved to the kitchen to make the chamomile tea he sometimes accepted when he was overwhelmed. While the water boiled, she pulled out her phone and opened the school's parent portal, scrolling through Eli's schedule and teacher contacts. Something had happened today, something more than a simple fall, and she intended to find out what. Her phone lit up with a notification from a number she didn't recognize, and she opened it to find a link with a message. "Thought you should see this. Sarah Mitchell, Adam's mom from bio class." Lena clicked the link with growing dread and found herself staring at a TikTok video of her son standing at his locker, his hands moving in the self-soothing gesture she recognized immediately, his face showing stress and discomfort. The caption made her stomach turn. The comments section was worse. Hundreds of strangers offering their opinions about her son, calling him names, making jokes, dissecting his behavior like he was a specimen rather than a person. She watched the video 3 times, noting the angle that suggested it had been filmed deliberately, noting the laughter in the background, noting every detail that confirmed this wasn't random, but targeted. Her hands shook with rage, a white-hot fury that she rarely allowed herself to feel because anger didn't solve problems, and she'd learned long ago that losing her temper just made people dismiss her as an emotional woman who couldn't handle her difficult child. But right now, in this moment, she wanted to scream. She wanted to find whoever filmed this and make them understand the damage they'd done. Instead, she screenshot the video, documented the account name and caption, and began composing an email to Principal Hayes. Her fingers moved across the phone keyboard with deliberate precision, each word chosen carefully to convey seriousness without hysteria, concern without accusation. She explained what had happened, attached the screenshots, requested an immediate meeting to discuss the school's anti-bullying policies and how they were clearly failing her son. She read it through twice, adjusted 3 sentences, and hit send before she could second-guess herself. Then she carried the cup of chamomile tea to Eli's closed door and knocked twice, softly. "I'm leaving this outside your door," she said through the wood. "No pressure to drink it or talk. I'm here when you're ready." She heard a small sound that might have been acknowledgement and returned to the kitchen, where she sat at the table and put her head in her hands. How many more times could they do this? How many more incidents could Eli endure before something inside him broke permanently? She'd fought so hard to give him a normal life, to integrate him into mainstream education, to prove that he belonged in the same world as everyone else. But what if she'd been wrong? What if her insistence on normalcy was actually harming him, exposing him to cruelty he'd be protected from in a different environment? The questions spiraled in her mind, each one leading to 3 more, until she felt like she was drowning in uncertainty. Her phone buzzed with a response from Principal Hayes, faster than she'd expected, requesting a meeting tomorrow morning before school. She confirmed the time, and then opened her work schedule, calculating which shift she'd have to miss, how many hours of pay she'd lose, whether Carl would finally decide she was more trouble than she was worth. But those were tomorrow's problems. Today's problem was the 15-year-old boy locked in his room, processing trauma in whatever way his unique mind processed things, and hoping that his mother could somehow make the world less cruel. Eli didn't emerge from his room until nearly 8 o'clock that evening, and when he did, his eyes were red-rimmed, and his face had the hollowed-out look of someone who'd been crying for hours. Lena was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, researching online schooling options and alternative education programs, when she heard his door creak. She closed the laptop immediately and watched as he moved to the refrigerator, pulled out the milk carton, and poured himself a glass with mechanical precision. He didn't look at her, but his presence in the shared space felt like an invitation. "Do you want to talk about it?" Lena asked gently, keeping her voice low and even. Eli stood at the counter with his back to her, the milk glass gripped in both hands. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer, that he'd retreat back to his room with the silence intact. But then his shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath, and he turned to face her. His expression was difficult to read, somewhere between resignation and determination, like someone who'd made a decision, but wasn't sure it was the right one. "They posted a video of me," he said, his voice flat in that way it got when he was trying to control his emotions through careful modulation. "At my locker. This morning. Marcus filmed it and put it on TikTok, and now everyone's seen it and they're all laughing." The words came out in a rush, breaking his usual careful speech pattern, and Lena's heart cracked a little more. She'd already seen the video, already knew the scope of the humiliation, but hearing him describe it made it real in a different way. "I know," she said. "Someone sent it to me. I've already contacted the school." Eli's eyes widened slightly, and she saw fear flash across his face. "Mom, no. Don't make it worse. If you complain, they'll just target me more. That's how it works." His logic was sound, she realized with growing horror, because he'd clearly experienced this pattern before. Speak up about bullying and become a bigger target. Stay silent and endure. Those were the only options he saw, and both of them were terrible. "What happened in the cafeteria?" she asked, changing tactics. Eli took a sip of milk and then set the glass down carefully on the counter, lining it up with the edge of the tile. "Tyler tripped me, on purpose. I fell, and my lunch went everywhere and everyone laughed and took pictures. Then they followed me to the bathroom and stood outside my stall saying things." His voice remained monotone, but his hands had started trembling, and Lena watched as he gripped the counter edge to steady them. She wanted to scoop him into her arms the way she had when he was small, when a hug could fix most problems. But he was 15 now, and touch didn't comfort him the way it once had. Instead, she stayed seated, giving him space while maintaining presence. "I'm meeting with Principal Hayes tomorrow morning. You don't have to go to school. I'm calling you in sick." Eli's head snapped up, and she saw a war playing out behind his eyes, relief battling with something else she couldn't quite identify. "I can't miss school," he said. "I have a test in geometry, and if I miss it, I'll have to make it up, and that messes up the schedule, and then I'll be behind," and his breathing was coming faster now, the familiar signs of anxiety spiraling. Lena stood and moved closer, stopping just outside his personal space. "Eli, listen to me. One test doesn't matter. Your mental health matters. You matter more than geometry." But even as she said it, she knew her words were bouncing off the rigid framework of his mind that needed order and routine more than comfort. "They're going to win," Eli said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made Lena's blood run cold. Not anger, not even sadness, resignation. The voice of someone who'd accepted defeat as inevitable. They're going to keep doing this, and I'm going to keep being the weird kid, and nothing's going to change, because this is just how the world works. I'm different, and people hate different, and that's just the truth. He picked up his milk glass and walked past her toward his room, and Lena felt like she'd failed some crucial test she hadn't known she was taking. Eli, wait. He paused in the doorway but didn't turn around. Lena searched for words that would penetrate the wall of resignation he'd built around himself. Different isn't wrong. Your brain is different, yes, but that doesn't make you less than anyone else. Those kids who are mocking you, they're cruel because they're scared of anything they don't understand. That's their failing, not yours. She watched his shoulders tense, watched him process her words through whatever filter his mind used to evaluate information. You have to say that, he replied without turning. You're my mom. But out there, he gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the world beyond their small apartment. Out there, I'm just the autistic kid who can't make friends and talks weird and does weird things with his hands. And there's a video now proving it, and it has hundreds of views, maybe thousands by tomorrow. So yeah, different isn't wrong in theory, but in practice? In practice, it gets you tripped in the cafeteria and trapped in bathrooms and turned into a joke for people's entertainment. The bleak accuracy of his assessment hit Lena like a physical blow. He was 15 and already so tired, already so aware of how the world saw him, already constructing defenses that looked like acceptance but were really just survival strategies. She thought about all the times she'd told him to be himself, to be proud of who he was, all the well-meaning platitudes that sounded good but crumbled against the reality of daily cruelty. What right did she have to tell him the world would be kind when she knew it wouldn't? You're right, she said finally, and saw his shoulders twitch with surprise. The world is often cruel to people who are different, but that doesn't mean you have to let them win. That doesn't mean you accept their definition of who you are. Eli turned then, just slightly, enough that she could see his profile. Then what do I do? Because ignoring them isn't working, and fighting back just makes it worse, and telling adults just makes me look weak. So what's the option I'm missing? Lena didn't have an answer. Not one that would satisfy him. Not one that would actually solve the problem. She opened her mouth and closed it again, the weight of her inadequacy pressing down on her chest. This was the moment she was supposed to have wisdom, supposed to offer a solution that would protect him while teaching him strength. But all she had was the truth, which was that sometimes there were no good options, only less bad ones. And navigating that reality was the hardest lesson anyone had to learn. I don't know, she admitted. I don't have a perfect answer. But I know that you're stronger than you think you are, and I know that one day these people won't matter anymore. High school isn't forever, even though it feels like it is. Eli studied her face for a long moment, and she saw him evaluating her honesty, deciding whether to trust it. Finally, he nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and disappeared into his room. The door clicked shut behind him, and Lena was left standing in the kitchen wondering if she'd said the right thing or just offered empty comfort that would dissolve under the weight of tomorrow. She returned to her laptop and the research she'd been doing, scrolling through homeschool curricula and online programs that promised personalized education in safe environments. The costs made her eyes water, numbers that would require her to work doubles every week and give up the small luxuries that made their life bearable. But if it meant protecting Eli from more days like today, she'd find a way to make it work. She always found a way. That was what mothers did, what she'd been doing since the divorce, since the diagnosis, since the moment she'd realized the world wasn't built for kids like her son, and she'd have to rebuild parts of it herself. The next morning arrived too quickly, dragging with it a confrontation Lena had been mentally preparing for since midnight. She'd slept in 40-minute intervals, her mind running through arguments and counter-arguments, anticipating every dismissive response Principal Hayes might offer. Eli had refused breakfast, retreating into nonverbal communication that told her his battery for human interaction was completely drained. She'd left him at home with strict instructions to keep his phone nearby, knowing that being alone was what he needed, even if it terrified her to leave him. Meadowbrook High School looked different in the early morning light, less imposing somehow, just a collection of brick and glass that happened to house her son's daily torture. Lena parked in the visitor lot and checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, making sure she looked composed and serious rather than desperate or emotional. She'd learned that appearing too invested in your child's well-being made administrators defensive, as if caring deeply was a character flaw that undermined credibility. She grabbed the folder containing her printed screenshots and notes, took a steadying breath, and walked toward the main entrance. Principal Hayes's office smelled like stale coffee and the particular mustiness of old books. He was a tall man in his late 50s with silver hair and the kind of measured calm that came from decades of managing conflicts. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, and Lena sat, placing her folder deliberately in front of her. Mrs. Davidson was also present, notepad ready, her expression professionally neutral. Lena recognized this configuration immediately. Witnesses to ensure nothing could be disputed later. Protection for the institution rather than the student. Mrs. Harper, thank you for coming in, Principal Hayes began, his tone suggesting this was a courtesy rather than a necessity. I understand you have concerns about an incident involving Eli yesterday. We take all reports of bullying very seriously here at Meadowbrook. The script was so familiar Lena could have recited it herself. She'd heard variations of this speech from 3 different schools across Eli's educational career, and it always preceded explanations of why nothing could actually be done. A student deliberately tripped my son in the cafeteria, causing him to fall and spill his lunch in front of 300 peers who photographed and mocked him, Lena said, keeping her voice level. That same student, along with others, then followed him to the bathroom and harassed him while he was locked in a stall trying to cope with the overwhelming stress. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was coordinated cruelty. She slid one of her printed screenshots across the desk, the TikTok video frozen on Eli's distressed face at his locker. Principal Hayes picked up the paper and studied it with a frown that might have been genuine concern or might have been annoyance at the complication this represented. I see. And do you know who posted this video? Lena provided Marcus's name and the account information, watched as Mrs. Davidson wrote it down dutifully. We'll certainly look into this. However, I should mention that incidents occurring on social media outside of school property and school hours fall into a gray area regarding our jurisdiction. There it was, the first deflection. Lena had expected it, but still felt anger flash through her chest. The video was filmed on school property, during school hours, in a school hallway. The harassment in the cafeteria occurred on school property during lunch. The bathroom incident occurred on school property. At what point does it become your jurisdiction? Her voice had sharpened despite her efforts to remain calm, and she saw Mrs. Davidson's pen pause on the notepad. Of course, you're absolutely right, Principal Hayes said smoothly, the verbal equivalent of patting her on the head. What I mean is that we're somewhat limited in how we can address social media content once it's been posted. We can certainly speak with the students involved about the in-school incidents, issue warnings, perhaps detention if warranted. But we can't force the removal of content from private social media accounts. Lena leaned forward, her hands flat on his desk. That video has been viewed over 2,000 times now. My son is being mocked by strangers across the country. His face, his private moment of stress, his personal struggle with a neurological condition is entertainment for people who will never understand the courage it takes him just to walk through your doors every day. And you're telling me you're limited? Her voice cracked on the last word, the emotion she'd been suppressing breaking through despite her best efforts. Principal Hayes exchanged a glance with Mrs. Davidson, and Lena recognized the silent communication between administrators who dealt with difficult parents before. I understand this is distressing. Perhaps we should discuss whether Meadowbrook is the right fit for Eli's educational needs. We do have information about alternative programs, specialized schools, that cater specifically to students on the spectrum who might benefit from more structured, supportive environments. There it was. The gentle suggestion that Eli was the problem, that his presence created difficulties better solved by his absence. My son has every right to attend public school without being terrorized, Lena said quietly, dangerously. He's not the problem here. The students who targeted him are the problem. Your staff who witnessed bullying and looked away are the problem. Your policies that somehow can't address cruelty when it's documented and undeniable are the problem. Don't you dare suggest that he should leave because you can't control your students." The silence that followed her words felt heavy, charged with unspoken tensions. "Mrs. Harper, I think we're getting off track," Mrs. Davidson interjected, her tone attempting diplomacy. "No one is suggesting Eli should leave. We're simply trying to explore all options that might improve his daily experience here. We want him to succeed and feel safe." Lena turned her gaze to the assistant principal, and something in her expression made the woman shift uncomfortably. "If you wanted him to feel safe, you would have intervened yesterday. You would have noticed when 3 boys trapped him in a bathroom. You would have stopped the video from being filmed in the first place." Principal Hayes cleared his throat, reclaiming control of the conversation. "I'll personally speak with Marcus Chen and the other students you've identified. They'll receive appropriate disciplinary action, I assure you. We'll also remind our staff to be more vigilant about monitoring student interactions. Is there anything else you'd like us to address?" The dismissal was clear in his tone, the meeting wrapping up whether Lena was satisfied or not. She gathered her folder and stood, knowing that this conversation had accomplished exactly as much as she'd feared it would. Nothing substantial. "Yes," she said from the doorway. "I want you to remember that Eli is a person, not a statistic or an inconvenient case file. When you speak to those boys, I want you to make them understand the real harm they caused, not just give them a slap on the wrist and send them back to class where they'll resent him even more for getting them in trouble. And I want you to know that if this continues, if my son is targeted again, I won't just come to your office. I'll go to the school board, the local news, anyone who will listen. Because someone needs to care about what happens to kids like Eli, and if it can't be you, it'll have to be me." Lena returned home to find Eli exactly where she'd left him, curled on the couch under his weighted blanket with his laptop balanced on his knees. He looked up when she entered, his eyes asking questions his voice wouldn't form. She shook her head slightly. A gesture he understood meant the meeting had gone as poorly as they'd both expected. His expression didn't change, but she saw his shoulders slump in a way that suggested he'd been holding on to some small thread of hope that was now severed. She wanted to tell him it would get better, that Principal Hayes would fix everything. But lies felt more cruel than silence. "They're going to talk to Marcus and the others," she said, dropping her purse on the kitchen counter. "Give them detention or whatever meaningless consequence makes the school feel like they've done something." Eli nodded, his fingers absently tracing patterns on the blanket's textured surface. "So nothing changes," he said. And it wasn't a question. Lena moved to sit on the opposite end of the couch, respecting his space while maintaining proximity. "I'm sorry. I tried. I really tried to make them understand." "It's not your fault," Eli replied, his eyes returning to his laptop screen. "The system isn't built for people like me. It's built for people who fit into neat categories and don't require extra attention or accommodation. I'm an inconvenience that they tolerate because they legally have to." The clinical accuracy of his assessment made Lena's chest ache. He developed this analytical detachment as a coping mechanism, she realized, treating his own oppression like a research subject he could study from a safe emotional distance. "What are you working on?" she asked, noticing the intense focus he was directing at the screen. Eli hesitated, his fingers pausing over the keyboard, and she recognized the internal debate about whether to share. "I'm writing something," he said finally, "for the talent show next month. I wasn't going to do it, but then I thought maybe I should. Maybe if I explain things the right way, people might understand instead of just laugh." Hope and fear warred in his voice, and Lena felt her heart constrict. The talent show. She'd forgotten it was coming up, the annual event where students performed music or comedy or dance routines for the whole school. Eli had never participated before, had always viewed it as another social ritual designed for extroverts who craved attention. The idea of him voluntarily putting himself on that stage, making himself vulnerable in front of the same people who'd mocked him, filled her with protective terror. But she saw something in his face that stopped her from voicing her concerns, a fragile determination that might shatter if she questioned it. "What kind of something?" she asked carefully. Eli pulled his laptop closer, a protective gesture, as if the words on the screen were too precious or too dangerous to expose casually. "A speech, I guess." about what it's like being autistic in a world that treats it like a joke or a tragedy but never like just a different way of being human, about how the same people who say they support neurodiversity are the ones laughing at videos of me stimming. His voice gained strength as he spoke, conviction replacing uncertainty. Lena felt tears prick her eyes, but blinked them back because crying would make this about her feelings rather than his courage. "Can I read it?" she asked, gently. Eli's hand moved to close the laptop, an instinctive defense, but then stopped. He turned the screen toward her slightly, not quite offering but not refusing either. She leaned forward and read the opening lines, words that were simultaneously simple and devastating. Observations about loneliness and misunderstanding delivered in Eli's characteristically direct style that somehow made them more powerful. "This is incredible," she whispered, and meant it. "Eli, this is really truly incredible." He pulled the laptop back, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment or pleasure or both. "It's not finished. I don't know if I'll actually do it. Standing up there in front of everyone sounds impossible when I think about it too much. But I keep imagining Marcus's face if I said these things out loud, if I made him actually listen instead of just dismissing me as robot boy. Maybe it would change something. Or maybe I'd just make myself an even bigger target." The vulnerability in that admission broke something open in Lena's chest. This was the impossible calculus her son lived with every day, weighing the potential for change against the certainty of additional pain. "Whatever you decide, I'm proud of you for even considering it," she said. "Most people never find the courage to speak their truth, especially not at 15, especially not to an audience that's been cruel to them. If you do this, it'll be brave. If you don't, that's brave too, because sometimes walking away is the strongest choice." Eli absorbed her words with the focused concentration he applied to everything, processing them through his unique cognitive filter. "Mom," he said after a long pause, "do you think people can actually change? Like, if Marcus heard me explain what it's really like, would he suddenly feel bad and stop being an asshole? Or is that just wishful thinking?" The question contained an ocean of longing disguised as intellectual curiosity, and Lena weighed her answer carefully because honesty mattered more than comfort. "I think some people can change if they're confronted with the humanity of someone they've dehumanized," she said slowly. "But I also think some people are so invested in cruelty that nothing will reach them. The question isn't whether Marcus will change. The question is whether saying these things will help you, whether speaking your truth has value regardless of how it's received. Because your words matter, Eli. Your perspective matters. Not because it might convert bullies into allies, but because it deserves to exist in the world." He nodded, his gaze distant, clearly turning her words over in his mind, the way he turned over interesting rocks at the beach, examining them from multiple angles. "I'm going to finish writing it," he decided. "And then I'm going to practice saying it out loud until it doesn't make me want to throw up. And then maybe, if I don't lose my nerve, I'll actually do it. Sign up for the talent show and stand on that stage and say everything I've been too scared to say." The determination in his voice was fragile but real, a seedling pushing through concrete. Lena wanted to protect him from the potential fallout, wanted to wrap him in safety, and never let the world touch him again. But she recognized that this wasn't her choice to make, that Eli was reaching for something important, even if it was wrapped in risk. "I'll be there," she said simply. "Front row. No matter what happens, I'll be there." Eli met her eyes briefly, a flash of connection that he typically avoided, and she saw gratitude mixed with fear, mixed with something that might have been hope. "Can you help me practice?" he asked. "I mean, not now, but eventually. I need to know if it sounds okay when I say it out loud, if the words work the way they do in my head." Lena felt her throat tighten with emotion, but kept her voice steady. "Of course. Whenever you're ready, we'll practice as many times as you need." Eli returned his attention to his laptop, his fingers resuming their movement across the keyboard, and Lena stood quietly, leaving him to his work. She moved to the kitchen and began preparing lunch neither of them would probably eat, needing the familiar motions to settle the storm in her chest. Her son was planning to step into the arena that had wounded him, armed with nothing but honesty and the desperate hope that truth might matter more than cruelty. Part of her wanted to talk him out of it, to spare him the potential devastation if it went wrong. But a larger part recognized that this was his battle to fight, his choice to make, and the best thing she could do was stand beside him and catch him if he fell. 3 weeks passed in a strange suspension of normalcy, where everything felt both routine and fundamentally altered. Eli returned to school after 2 days of absence, walking through those doors with visible dread that made Lena's heart fracture each morning she watched him go. Marcus and his friends had received 3 days of detention, a consequence so minor it barely registered as punishment, and the administration considered the matter resolved. The TikTok video remained online, despite Lena's reports, accumulating views and comments that ranged from mockery to surprising defense, strangers arguing about neurodiversity in a comment section that had become an accidental battleground. But something had shifted in Eli during those 3 weeks. He came home each afternoon and disappeared into his room, emerging only for meals he ate in mechanical silence before returning to whatever he was working on behind his closed door. Lena heard him sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep, speaking aloud to himself in a rhythm that suggested practice and repetition. He was rehearsing his speech, she realized, preparing for the talent show that loomed like a storm on the horizon. She didn't push him to share it yet, respecting his process while anxiety gnawed at her constantly. The morning of the talent show arrived with unseasonable warmth, spring asserting itself early with aggressive cheerfulness that felt mismatched to the weight of the day. Eli had barely touched his breakfast, his leg bouncing under the table in a repetitive pattern that signaled high stress. "You don't have to do this," Lena reminded him gently, giving him an exit if he needed one. "No one will think less of you if you change your mind." But Eli shook his head with a firmness that surprised her, his jaw set in determination that looked almost foreign on his typically uncertain face. "I signed up. My name's on the list. If I back out now, it'll just confirm what they already think, that I'm too weird and too scared to handle normal things." His logic was painful in its clarity, revealing how deeply he'd internalized others' perceptions of him. Lena wanted to argue that backing out would be self-preservation rather than weakness, but she recognized the look in his eyes. He'd crossed some internal threshold where retreat felt more dangerous than advance, and nothing she said would pull him back. The talent show was scheduled for 7th period in the auditorium, which meant Eli had to survive 6 periods of regular classes while carrying the weight of what was coming. Lena had arranged to leave work early, claiming a doctor's appointment because telling Carl the truth, that her son was about to do something terrifyingly brave and she needed to witness it, would have invited questions she couldn't answer. She arrived at Meadowbrook High at 1:30, parking in the visitor lot that was already filling with parents whose children had less fraught performances planned. The auditorium was larger than she'd expected, rows of seats sloping down toward a stage with burgundy curtains and professional lighting. Students filed in by class, their voices creating a din that made Lena wince, imagining how overwhelming this must be for Eli backstage. She'd claimed a seat in the 3rd row, close enough to see his face clearly, close enough that he'd know she was there, even if eye contact was impossible for him. Other parents scattered throughout the audience, most of them looking at their phones while they waited, treating this as a minor obligation rather than a pivotal moment. Principal Hayes walked onto the stage to scattered applause, his voice booming through the microphone as he welcomed everyone to Meadowbrook's annual talent showcase. He listed the order of performances with bureaucratic efficiency, and Lena's stomach dropped when she heard Eli's name. He was performing 8th out of 12, positioned in that terrible middle zone where attention might be waning, but the audience wasn't yet tired enough to be merciful. She clasped her hands in her lap and tried to control her breathing, tried to channel calm that Eli might somehow sense even from backstage. The first 7 acts passed in a blur Lena barely registered. A girl sang a pop ballad with admirable technical skill, but no particular emotional depth. 3 boys performed a comedy sketch that relied heavily on pratfalls and bathroom humor, earning enthusiastic laughter from their peers. A dance group executed a routine with impressive synchronization. Each performance received applause that ranged from polite to energetic, the audience settling into the familiar rhythm of a school event where participation mattered more than excellence. And then, Principal Hayes returned to the microphone and announced Eli's name. Lena's heart stopped as her son walked onto that stage. He moved with careful deliberation, each step measured, his hands gripping a single sheet of paper so tightly she could see it trembling from where she sat. He wore the navy hoodie he always wore, the security blanket disguised as clothing, and his face was pale under the stage lights. The auditorium didn't go silent, students still whispering to each other, but there was a shift in attention, a collective curiosity about what the weird kid might do. She saw Marcus in the audience, 6th row back, leaning forward with an expression that mixed anticipation with something uglier. Eli reached the microphone stand and stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds. Lena willed strength into him across the distance, her entire body tense with vicarious anxiety. She saw him close his eyes briefly, that quick reset he did when overwhelmed, and then open them again with something that looked like resolve. He unfolded his paper with shaking hands, smoothed it against the microphone stand, and began to speak in a voice so quiet, the first few words were lost in the ambient noise. "My name is Eli Harper," he said, his voice gaining slight volume, still monotone but carrying now, "and I'm autistic. I know that's supposed to be the part where I apologize or make a joke to make you comfortable, but I'm not going to do that." The auditorium actually did go quieter then, attention sharpening because this wasn't what anyone had expected. Students who'd been on their phones looked up. Teachers along the walls straightened. Even Principal Hayes, standing stage left, seemed surprised by the direction this was taking. 3 weeks ago, someone filmed me at my locker having a hard moment and posted it online for entertainment. They called me Robot Boy in the caption. A lot of you probably saw it. Some of you probably laughed. Eli's voice remained flat, but his words landed with precision, each sentence a carefully aimed dart. I want to tell you what that moment actually was, since the video didn't come with context. I was trying not to have a meltdown because the fluorescent lights were flickering at a frequency that felt like needles in my brain. Because someone's cologne was so strong I couldn't breathe properly. Because I'd just heard 3 different conversations simultaneously, and my brain can't filter sounds the way yours does, so it all comes in at equal volume and it's like trying to think inside a hurricane. Lena watched faces in the audience shift, discomfort replacing amusement, and she felt a fierce pride surge through her chest. Eli was doing it. He was actually doing it. His hands still shook and his voice still carried no emotional inflection, but his words were landing, piercing through the defensive armor of adolescent cruelty with uncomfortable truth. She saw a girl 2 rows ahead lean over to whisper something to her friend, both of them looking genuinely troubled. "You think I don't know I'm different?" Eli continued, his eyes fixed somewhere above the audience's heads, unable to make contact but present nonetheless. "You think I don't notice when you laugh or whisper, or move away when I sit too close? I notice everything. That's part of being autistic. My brain doesn't filter out the irrelevant stuff, so I see every eye roll, hear every mocking laugh, feel every moment of rejection like a physical weight. I just don't always know how to respond in ways that make sense to you, so you interpret my silence as not caring. But I care so much, it's painful." The auditorium was completely silent now, 300 students and dozens of adults holding their collective breath. Lena saw Marcus's expression change, the smirk fading into something that might have been shame or might have been anger at having his entertainment deconstructed into harm. She couldn't tell and didn't care, because her entire focus was on her son standing on that stage, speaking truth to power with a courage that made her own breath catch. Eli's hands had stopped shaking, she noticed, as if speaking the words aloud had transferred the trembling from his body into the air itself, making the entire auditorium vibrate with uncomfortable tension. He glanced down at his paper but didn't seem to be reading anymore, the words flowing from some deeper place that had broken through his careful preparation. The video got 2,000 views in 24 hours. 2,000 people who don't know me decided they knew enough to judge me based on 30 seconds of my worst moment. And I kept thinking, what if they saw the whole picture? What if they knew I taught myself marine biology because no one else cared about jellyfish the way I do? What if they knew I remember every kind thing anyone's ever said to me because kindness is rare enough to be remarkable? She watched him take a breath, saw his fingers find the edge of his hoodie sleeve, and rub the fabric briefly before releasing it. "I'm not asking for pity. I don't want you to feel sorry for me because pity is just another way of saying someone is less than whole. I'm asking for something harder than pity. I'm asking you to see me as completely human, even though my humanity looks different than yours. I'm asking you to consider that the weird things I do, the things you find funny or uncomfortable, are actually my brain's way of surviving in a world that wasn't designed for brains like mine. His voice cracked slightly on the last sentence, the only break in his monotone delivery, and that crack somehow made the words more powerful. Marcus shifted in his seat, and Lena saw him look down at his hands as if they'd suddenly become fascinating. Tyler sat next to him, his face red. Whether from embarrassment or anger, Lena couldn't determine. Josh had his arms crossed, defensive body language that suggested the words were hitting too close to something he didn't want to acknowledge. Around them, other students sat in various states of discomfort, confronted with their own complicity and cruelty that had seemed harmless when it was happening, but looked different under this spotlight of honesty. "There's this thing people say about autism," Eli continued, his gaze still fixed somewhere in the middle distance. "They say we lack empathy, that we can't understand other people's emotions. But that's backwards. I understand your emotions so intensely that I have to protect myself from them because feeling everything you feel, plus everything I feel, is overwhelming. When you're angry near me, I feel it like static electricity on my skin. When you're sad, it sits in my chest like a stone. And when you're cruel, when you laugh at someone's pain because it makes you feel powerful for a moment, I feel that too. I feel the pleasure you take in someone else's humiliation, and it makes me understand that maybe the real empathy problem isn't mine." The silence had transformed from uncomfortable to profound, and Lena saw tears on several faces now, not just parents but students too. Teenagers whose carefully constructed social armor was cracking under the weight of recognition. A girl in the front row had her hand over her mouth. A boy near the back had his head bowed. Even some of the teachers looked shaken, confronted perhaps with their own failures to protect students like Eli from the daily violence of social hierarchy. Principal Hayes stood frozen stage left, his expression unreadable, but his posture suggesting he understood that something significant was happening, something he couldn't control or contain. "I don't know if this speech will change anything," Eli said, his voice softening slightly. "Probably some of you are already thinking about how to make fun of this later. How to turn my vulnerability into another joke. That's okay. I can't control what you do with what I've said. But I needed to say it anyway, because silence feels like agreement, like accepting that the way things are is the way things have to be. And maybe for me specifically, nothing changes. Maybe I'm still Robot Boy tomorrow. But maybe one person in this room will think twice before filming someone's hard moment. Maybe one person will remember that different doesn't mean defective. That would be enough." He paused, looking down at his paper one final time, and Lena saw his lips move silently as if checking that he'd said everything he needed to say. Then he looked up, not quite at the audience but in their general direction, and delivered his final line with a simplicity that made it devastating. "My brain works differently than yours, but it still works. It still feels. It still matters. I still matter, and if you can't see that, the problem isn't my autism. The problem is your empathy." He stepped back from the microphone, folded his paper carefully, and walked off stage with the same measured steps he'd used to enter, leaving behind a silence so complete that Lena could hear her own heartbeat. Then someone started clapping. Just one person at first, slow, deliberate applause that echoed in the vast space, and Lena realized with shock that it was Marcus. He was standing, his hands coming together in applause that looked painful, his face contorted with something between anguish and recognition. And then others joined, first a trickle and then a wave, students rising from their seats, the sound building from scattered claps into thunderous approval that shook the auditorium. Teachers joined, parents joined, even Principal Hayes was applauding, his expression suggesting he understood he'd just witnessed something beyond the usual boundaries of a school talent show. Lena stood with everyone else, tears streaming down her face, her hands aching from clapping so hard, watching as her son disappeared backstage, having just performed the bravest act she'd ever witnessed. The standing ovation continued for what felt like minutes, time stretching and compressing in the emotional intensity of the moment. She saw students crying, saw them hugging each other, saw the physical manifestation of something shifting in the collective consciousness of this room. Not everyone would change. Not everyone would suddenly become kind, but something had cracked open, some possibility that hadn't existed before Eli spoke his truth. When the applause finally died down and people began sitting, Lena noticed Marcus still standing, his hands covering his face, his shoulders shaking with what looked like sobs. Tyler had an arm around him, both of them caught in whatever private reckoning Eli's words had triggered. Josh sat stiffly, his expression unchanged, but his jaw clenched so tightly Lena could see the muscle jumping. The complexity of their responses suggested Eli's speech had hit deeper than simple shame, had touched something about their own humanity they'd been avoiding. Whether that would translate to actual behavior change remained to be seen, but the possibility existed where it hadn't before. The rest of the talent show continued, but Lena couldn't focus on any of it. Her entire being concentrated on the door stage right where Eli had disappeared. She wanted to go to him immediately, to find him backstage and hold him and tell him how extraordinary he was, but she forced herself to stay seated, to let him process whatever he was feeling in his own time and space. When the final performer finished, and Principal Hayes returned to close the event, she barely heard his words, already moving toward the aisle, planning the fastest route to her son. She found him eventually in a small practice room behind the stage, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his knees pulled to his chest. He looked up when she entered, and she saw exhaustion in every line of his body, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from exposing yourself completely. She sat down next to him, not touching but close, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Finally Eli said, "Did I do okay?" And his voice was so small, so vulnerable, that Lena felt her heart crack open all over again. "You did more than okay," she whispered. "Eli, you were magnificent. You changed something in that room. I saw it on their faces." He nodded slowly, processing her words through his exhaustion. "Marcus was crying," he said, and there was wonder in his voice, as if he couldn't quite believe that his words had penetrated that particular armor. "I saw," Lena confirmed. "I don't know what that means for tomorrow or next week, but tonight, your truth mattered to him. It mattered to a lot of people." Eli leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes, and Lena saw the tension slowly drain from his body. "I'm really tired, Mom," he said quietly. "Can we go home?" She stood and offered him her hand, and for once he took it, letting her pull him to his feet. They walked out of Meadowbrook High together as the sun set behind the building, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. And Lena thought about how much courage it took to speak truth in a world designed to silence difference, and how proud she was that her son had found that courage even when the cost was so high. The video appeared online that night, but this time it was different. Someone had filmed Eli's entire speech from the audience, the camera steady and the audio clear, and by morning it had been shared across multiple platforms with captions that ranged from "This made me cry" to "Everyone needs to hear this." Lena discovered it when her phone started buzzing with notifications from people she hadn't spoken to in years. Messages saying they'd seen the video, that they were moved, that they wanted her to know her son was brave. She watched it 3 times in the kitchen while Eli slept, seeing her son's courage preserved in digital format, his words reaching far beyond the Meadowbrook High auditorium. By afternoon, the video had 50,000 views. By evening, it had crossed 200,000. The comments section became a battleground and a support group simultaneously, neurotypical people arguing with each other about empathy, while autistic adults shared their own stories of being misunderstood, of surviving school systems that hadn't protected them, of recognizing themselves in Eli's words. Some comments were cruel, inevitable pushback from people who felt threatened by vulnerability, but they were drowned out by an overwhelming tide of support that made Lena's chest ache with relief and something like vindication. Eli's phone buzzed constantly with messages from classmates he'd never spoken to, most of them brief and awkward but genuine. That took guts from a girl in his geometry class. "I'm sorry I laughed at stuff before," from a boy whose name Eli didn't recognize. Even a few teachers reached out through official school emails, careful professional language that nonetheless conveyed respect. Marcus's message came late that night, a single sentence that Eli showed his mother with trembling hands. "I'm sorry for everything. I mean it." 3 words that couldn't undo damage, but represented a beginning. The next day at school felt surreal, Eli reported to his mother that evening. People he'd never spoken to said hello in hallways. Some gave him space in ways that felt respectful rather than avoidant. The cafeteria was still overwhelming, but when he sat at his usual corner table, 2 students from his biology class asked if they could join him, and the conversation that followed was halting and imperfect, but real. Tyler avoided him completely, which felt safer than confrontation. Josh nodded once in passing, a minimal acknowledgement that suggested discomfort, but not active hostility. Marcus approached him during lunch, Eli told his mother, his hands shoved deep in his pockets and his eyes on the floor. He'd stood there for a full minute without speaking, the silence stretching awkwardly, before finally saying he understood if Eli hated him, but wanted Eli to know the speech had made him realize things about himself he didn't like. Eli hadn't known how to respond, so he'd just nodded, and Marcus had walked away. And somehow that imperfect interaction felt more honest than any apology could have been. The acknowledgement mattered more than forgiveness. The school administration struggled with the sudden attention, Principal Hayes calling an assembly to address the viral video and reminding students about the school's values of inclusion and respect, words that felt hollow given their previous inaction, but represented at least a symbolic shift. Mrs. Davidson pulled Eli aside to tell him the school was proud of him, a statement that made him uncomfortable because pride implied ownership of his courage. But he accepted it with his characteristic politeness, understanding that adults needed to feel like they'd contributed even when they'd mostly failed. Local news picked up the story, a segment about the autistic teen whose speech was resonating across the internet, and a reporter contacted Lena requesting an interview. She declined, protecting Eli's privacy, but the attention kept building. Advocacy organizations reached out wanting to share his message. Other schools invited him to speak, though the thought of repeating that performance filled him with dread. He'd done it once, poured everything into those minutes on stage, and the idea of commodifying that vulnerability felt wrong even if the intentions were good. What surprised Eli most, he confessed to his mother 2 weeks later, was how exhausting positive attention could be. People treating him like an inspiration felt almost as dehumanizing as people treating him like a joke, reducing him to a symbol rather than seeing him as simply himself. He appreciated the support, but found himself retreating more, needing extra recovery time from the constant social engagement that came with being visible. Fame, even minor and temporary fame, carried costs he hadn't anticipated. The biology project with Marcus, Tyler, and Josh became an unexpected turning point. They met at the library, all 4 of them visibly uncomfortable, and Marcus suggested they divide the work equally, instead of dumping it on Eli. The project itself was unremarkable, a standard ecosystem presentation, but the process of creating it together felt significant. Tyler made an awkward joke that fell flat and then apologized. Josh asked Eli a genuine question about his jellyfish knowledge and actually listened to the answer. These small gestures accumulated into something resembling functional collaboration. Lena watched these changes from her necessary distance, seeing her son navigate new social terrain with cautious optimism. She knew this wasn't a fairy tale ending, where everything was suddenly perfect. Eli still struggled daily with sensory overload and social exhaustion. The cafeteria still felt overwhelming. Some students still viewed him through the lens of his disability rather than his humanity. But something had fundamentally shifted, a crack in the wall between him and his peers that let small amounts of understanding seep through. The talent show speech became a marker in their lives, a before and after that divided time. Before, when Eli was primarily defined by what made him different. After, when at least some people had been forced to see beyond the label to the person underneath. It wasn't a cure for prejudice or ignorance, Lena understood, but it was a beginning. Evidence that speaking truth could create space for change, even when change felt impossible. Her son had stood on that stage and demanded to be seen, and enough people had actually looked. 3 months later, as spring dissolved into summer and the school year ended, Eli told his mother He'd been asked to speak at freshman orientation in the fall, a chance to welcome incoming students with a message about accepting difference. He was considering it, he said, though the thought still terrified him. Maybe fear was just part of courage, he suggested. The price you paid for trying to make things better. Lena agreed, thinking about all the times she'd been afraid for him, afraid with him, and moved forward anyway because love demanded it. The viral video eventually faded from active circulation, replaced by newer content in the endless scroll of internet attention. But its impact lingered in the students who'd heard it live, in the adults who'd been forced to examine their own failures, in the autistic teenagers across the country who'd watched it and felt less alone. Eli's words had traveled farther than he'd ever imagined possible, creating ripples he'd never fully witness, changing conversations in schools and homes and online spaces about what it meant to be different in a world that demanded conformity. On the last day of school, Lena picked up Eli and found him exhausted but smiling slightly, an expression rare enough to be notable. "Marcus said goodbye," he reported. Actually said he hoped I had a good summer and maybe we could hang out sometime. I don't know if we will, but it was nice that he said it. Lena reached over and squeezed his hand briefly, a touch he tolerated because the moment warranted it, and they drove home through familiar streets that somehow looked different now, lighter, as if speaking truth had literally changed the landscape. If Eli's courage to speak his truth moved you, or if you've ever felt invisible in a world that doesn't understand you, hit that subscribe button and join our community where every story matters. Like this video if you believe one voice can spark change, and share in the comments. Have you or someone you love ever been misunderstood for being different? Your story could give someone else the strength to keep going. We're all in this together.